Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I'm speaking from Washington, D.C. And thank you all very much for joining this webinar. Uh, this is an unusual webinar, actually. So some of it is what we all know so well, which is that we welcome questions. The event is being recorded, and it will be posted on the website. The recording will be posted on the website of the Berkeley Center shortly, and we will turn at a point during this meeting to your questions. But meanwhile, I want to focus on what it is we're trying to do today and why this is a somewhat unusual webinar. It is very much part of a conference that the Berkeley Center has organized on the issues of refugees and displaced people. The conference was held in person at Georgetown University on Monday for the full day, and that recording will be available soon on the Berkeley Center site. It is also part of a long-term project that the Berkeley Center is doing focused on the culture of encounter. So I will comment briefly on both of those and then turn it over to my fellow panelists and also first to Jocelyn Cesari, who is my colleague at the Berkeley Center and who is actually speaking from Israel today. So first, the context of the conference and the project. We are looking at two areas where religious dimensions of forced displacement and more broadly of plural societies are evident in their full complexity. Middle East conflicts and displacement and the situation in the United States. I also want to note that the major global climate event known as COP29 is now in full bore in Baku, Azerbaijan, with an ambitious faith pavilion where the religious impact on climate change is a focus, including, of course, on climate-inspired displacement. So first, turning to the conference on Monday, there were three separate panels. It was organized by a group within the Berkeley Center that includes me, that includes my colleague, David Hollenbach, Jocelyn Cesari, Jose Casanova, but also colleagues that include Ruth Messenger, who will be joining us shortly, Cynthia Lang, and some other colleagues. It is part, though, of a longer-term effort in the Berkeley Center to bring together the very diverse interests and commitments of the faculty and staff of the Berkeley Center. And this is focused particularly on refugees and forced displacement. Looking at the common calls and teachings of religious communities, but also the areas of division. In the conference on Monday, there were many very powerful inspirations, but also some very strong challenges as we looked at the road from the very personal aspects of reaching out to people who are displaced and who are suffering to the very global institutions, from the local, from the personal and community to the broad congregational, national, and transnational. So the first panel, which was chaired by Beth Ferris, who's another colleague in this, focused on the current rather frightening numbers on forced displacement, which are now at a record high of 122.6 million people, or one in about 69 people of the world population is displaced. They focused, the discussion there focused from the UN Refugee Organization, particularly on the very small percentage that are actually resettled in third countries, thus noting that the largest percentages of refugees and forced displacement people are in the country itself. Obviously, that's the internally displaced, or in neighboring countries, which are by and large low and middle income countries. It also focused on the phenomenon that we've been aware of for some time of protracted refugee situations where the situations are not temporary, which in a sense is the structure that's built into the system, but they are protracted refugee situations that go on for many years, even for almost lifetimes. So the question that we focus on is, what does religion have to do with it? What are the religious roles? And clearly, the predominance there is on the community, the first responders, the front line, the diversity of the responses, but also their very strong common elements. We also, though, in that discussion and throughout the day, focused on an old question. An old question: is the system simply broke? In other words, missing finance, or is it fundamentally broken, needing some revamping? And of course, the answer comes a bit to yes, both and, but with an emphasis, I think, on the aspects of the need to rethink some of these global approaches to the issues of refugees. Issues of information also came up. So that was really the focus of that first panel, which also brought the voices of former refugees who are now leaders in global advocacy. So that was, again, a very strong element of the first panel. The second panel, which was moderated by Reverend David Hollenbach at the Berkeley Center, and that panel focused very much on the strong common teachings of, particularly in this case, the Abrahamic faiths, Christian, Catholic, and Protestant, the Muslim and the Jewish teachings that call with such clarity to welcome the stranger, the need for openness, but it also came to focus on some of the issues that divide the teachings and, in many cases, but not universally, the leadership of these traditions from the practice at the congregation, at the individual level. The third panel was looking at case studies. It said it was moderated by Jose Casanova, again, Berkeley Center professor and stalwart. And it started by looking at the Myanmar-Bangladesh situation and therefore the Rohingya crisis, which now the Rohingya represent the largest single refugee camp sitting in Bangladesh. But Ellen Goldstein provided a very broad situation of the crisis within the broader context of Myanmar, Burma, and its history of isolation, and again highlighted the complexity of religious factors, positive and negative. We then heard from a representative of the community of Sant'Egidio about the humanitarian corridors approach, which has had remarkable success in showing the way to a more humane response to the refugee crisis. Sister Norma Pimental spoke from the vantage point of the southern border and again emphasized the importance of the compassion that is exemplified by religious teachings, but also by people when they are able to see it. And finally, Aza Karam, who is with Lead Integrity, but also has a long history with interreligious action focused on the Muslim aspects, both as displaced, but also attitudes that bar or that impede some of the responses from Muslim communities, and traced some of the aspects to colonial legacies as well as to the kinds of racism and discrimination that is evident despite the nobility of human rights standards and the vital role of human rights. She also emphasized the importance of interreligious approaches. So we were looking on Monday at the systemic issues in the broadest sense, and some of the questions of nationalism, the nation state, the systems, the global systems. And I think one important theme that went through was that this is not a temporary crisis, it is a permanent crisis. So the second theme I want to touch on is the culture of encounter, which is a project that is supported generously by the GHR Foundation, and it involves Georgetown and 3 Vatican dicasteries: culture and education, interreligious dialogue, and integral human development. And it's also very much inspired by Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical, but also the 2019 document on human fraternity for world peace and living together that was signed by Pope Francis and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. So it is a core Berkeley Center project to try to go deeper into the culture of encounter as a vision of religious, interreligious leadership encapsulated by that word encounter that goes beyond, but is grounded in dialogue, humility, curiosity, and other features. So it forces us to look both at the inspiration of the ideals and the leadership and the teachings, but also some of the tensions and contradictions of which we are acutely aware and which are a central theme in our discussion today. So the teachings are contested by some religious adherents and rejected by others who emphasize, for example, borders, security, and limits on asylum. National citizenship can trump all consideration for refugees, displaced, and other migrants who are driven, for example, by climate crises or even by simple search for better opportunities. So Pope Francis has proposed encounter as a way to frame our responsibility to the stranger and to bridge the division. So the creation of a culture of encounter in which we can also speak to those who think differently, as well as those who hold other beliefs who do not have the same faith. So he calls for a culture of encounter capable of transcending our differences and divisions, for all persons to act as fellow travelers, sharing the same flesh as children of the same earth, brothers and sisters all. So this conference seeks a productive dialogue. It goes in parallel with other efforts to look at children and child protection under the culture of encounter. But we're hoping to better understand what is at stake in the different religious traditions' positions on refugees and forced migration, and looking towards shared ways forward. So our aspiration is to help religious communities to have a greater impact on refugee policy into the future, individually and together. So with that, I will stop and hand over to my colleague, Jocelyn Cesari. She, as I said, is very focused particularly on the Middle East, and she will speak for a while, and then we'll turn to Ruth Messenger, who has joined us formerly and currently with American Jewish World Service, and Paul Rauschenbusch, who is a leader on interfaith issues, who also, I would add, has a very long and interesting history in an issue that is central to all of us, which is communication, including digital communication. So Jocelyn, over to you.
Let me get into the situation of the Middle East. As you know, the crises, plural, are unfolding, and there are overlapping conflicts from Syria, Yemen, Iraq, the war between Israel and Gaza, coupled with escalating political tension in Lebanon and Iran. So this confluence of geopolitical strife has produced a wave of forced migration, internally displaced millions of people, and heavy burden on the neighboring countries. So I know that in the first day of the conference, you talked a lot about numbers, but I just want to recap a few. Syria, the Syrian civil war resulted in over 6.8 million Syrians fleeing the country. In Yemen, according to the UNHCR, over 4 million internally displaced people, and millions in need of humanitarian assistance. Iraq, over 1 million Iraqi remain displaced as of recent years. And since the beginning of the war between Israel and Gaza, 1.9 million Gazans, which means 85% of the population, has been displaced. So these are very heavy and worrisome numbers. The connected issues is that very few countries, and most of the time neighboring countries, are hosting these refugees or are connected with these displaced people. Turkey, 4 million refugees. Lebanon, 1.75 million refugees. Syrian and Palestinian. Jordan, 2.5 million refugees, Syrian and Palestinians. So these are heavy loads on countries that have already very fragile economy, and also something we do not automatically pay attention to, very fragile religious equilibrium or balance in the society. For example, in Lebanon, when I see this number in the current situation, I cannot help thinking of the situation of the Palestinian refugees in the 70s that completely disturbed the equilibrium between Sunni, Shia, and Christian, and led to the civil war. We are in an exactly same situation, taking also into account that the economic situation of Lebanon is the worst that it has been in 3 or 4 decades. So these are very alarming factors. So when we look at religion, we usually look at the way that religious organization can provide help, both in local and international context, and you have heard a lot about that in the last 2 days conference. And we highlight the role of religious organization, from Islamic Relief to the Community of Sant'Egidio and other faith-based organizations. What I would like to bring the attention on today is the Religion Beyond organization. And here I'm referring to the way that people live without automatically justifying or cognitively articulating their needs in terms of religion, but it's exactly part of who they are, of the fabric of who they are, not only as persons, but also as a group. And that is the most challenging from the secular policy making, because we tend to see religion in a niche, you know, managed professionally by organizations and religious leaders, and the one who care or tend to the needs of the people. But there is another way of looking at it, as the way that people organize themselves and interact based on hierarchies that are not visible to the secular eye, about gender, about generation, about age, about education. And these are important elements that are also religiously influenced but embedded in culture. And that's the most challenging approach to religion, because it doesn't automatically reflect in an articulated discourse in the communication with humanitarian agencies. And that's something, I know we are short on time, but there is a way to look at religion through this angle that could be very beneficial to the population on the ground. I want just to finish with what I hope these 2 days of conference could achieve, which is to think of religion beyond denomination, and also to include the religious input on the humanitarian crisis in a broader ethical framework that doesn't separate religious moral or ethics and secular ethics. And in this sense, since we are talking under the purview of the culture of encounter, what the Pope Francis has started is quite interesting and innovative, because it's about this ethical framework to emphasize shared values, not emphasize a particular doctrine, religious doctrine, oppositional opposition vis-a-vis the tradition, but there we are sharing the same human condition, and we are all interested in social justice and solidarity. And why I am intrigued and also hopeful vis-a-vis such a position is that I can see the interest among other religious communities that are not Catholic, who are following with great interest this approach to religion as a sort of moral compass at the global level, and that can overcome not only the ideological divides, but also the political use of religion in different national contexts. So I hope that these 2 days and a half or webinar could help push us in this direction. So I want to close on that, and again advocate for a more nuanced approach to addressing the refugee crisis without ever losing the importance of religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And those are important challenges. I think that they came out very much during the meeting on Monday. Both the need to move beyond a very strict denominational, and to blend the institutional, the system issues with the way that people actually live them. So I think those are indeed themes. Let me turn now, actually, I am going to turn to you, Paul, as I had indicated earlier. You have a unique voice, a unique role in looking at the positive role of faith in our society. You've looked at that for decades. It's the essence of your life, but also your heritage. But you've also recently been traveling the country in a bus, dealing with these issues. And I can think of few people who have thought more about what the digital revolution is doing to the sort of religious landscape. So if you could pick up on any of those issues, and then we'll move into the more specific issues of what's happening in the United States, where we'll look to Ruth to help guide us through that.
Happy to, and it's an honor to be on this panel with 3 incredible women that I admire, and to talk about something so important. I have to admit that I'm I'm in a certain state of mind right now. So I'm going to be honest right now about how I'm feeling, and how I see religion. And I will get into technology because it's very intertwined with how religion is happening right now. I love the sentiments of Pope Francis and the sense of possibility of religion. In the United States right now, we're living with the reality that religion is actually more of the problem than the solution. And we have to take that very seriously. When is religion actually adverse to the well-being and welcome of refugees and migrants? And certainly in the United States, the recent election has pointed towards a surging anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-foreign anything sentiment. And a lot of that is fueled by religious ideals that are deeply embedded in the United States history, which we have. And I'll give counter examples, but I just think like there's a real, I think one of the main reasons that Trump won was his anti-immigrant in the most vitriolic and horrific terms, and demonization, and using phrases that are directly out of Great Replacement or fascistic understandings of poisoning our bloodstream. He once said, if they don't have our religion, we're going to send them back. And by our religion, that's it's a dog whistle to, of course, evangelicals, but also it's basically an anti-Muslim sentiment, and this real denigration of people from different communities who were the Haitian migrants in Springfield, and all of this is really feeding into a broad sense of America as a white Protestant nation, and anyone else who's trying to come here has to fit into that paradigm. And people really, people, again, it was only about half the country, but or not half the country, half of the voting population, but still an incredible amount of people showed their antipathy towards difference, and a lot of that was rooted in religious rhetoric that really portrayed people like this as actually representing evil and threat. And so I think we have to, I'm going to mention a few examples of ways this has happened in a positive way. There are examples of wonderful religious communities welcoming people from other religious communities into the life of the United States in very positive ways. That certainly has happened in Minnesota, where the Lutheran community has been very instrumental in welcoming Somali Muslims, and certainly I would say the Catholic Charities and others have been very welcoming of migrants on the southern border. But those very people are being attacked right now, and in fact, people are literally attacking Catholic churches for housing migrants. So I do not have a rosy picture right now. I think we have to be very careful about painting the possibility of religion without recognizing the deep hostility that religion has in this moment in the United States. And I think this is actually maybe internationally, but you all can tell me more. And I think actually the digital revolution, it's a blessing and a curse. You can find out, and you can encounter people different from yourselves and learn about them. And if you are curious and want to learn about different cultures, the internet is wonderful for that. But the way that it is functioning right now with disinformation and, it is largely fueling terrible and violent anti-refugee, anti-migrant behavior. We've seen that not just in the United States, but I think it recently happened in the UK. And so we have to be very, and I know that everyone on this panel and everybody listening is certainly aware of this, is how religion itself and religious communities, I do think that there is a shared morality in many religious traditions about welcoming the stranger and encountering the other and loving humanity. But equally, religion can be tribalistic and antagonistic. And so right now we're basically fighting that very, very fight right now in the United States. And it's going to be serious. And, we can't ignore the fact that, the plans are underway to just round people up and put them in camps and deport them. So I'm feeling, I'm in fighting mode. And I do think that many religious communities can come together in this moment and recognize our shared values, but I think we're in for a very tough time in the United States. And my bus tour actually, there's amazing people doing incredible work. We did a bus tour, across the Midwest, and everywhere we met, we started the Tri-Faiths initiatives. And, there you had, it's just incredible possibility, even in the face of global conflict, incredible possibility, and everywhere we went. But there is a ascendant cruelty that I think we also have to name, and an ascendant that plays very well, and just as it has played well in other times in our country, 20s, 30s. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I can't be more hopeful or rosy pictured, but I do think it's really important that we recognize there are many religious communities in America that are going to be standing up for people entering into the country and recognizing their value to our broader tapestry. And we will be fighting against a kind of Christian nationalism that has the lever and the powers of government who are going to be wielding them against us.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for that very honest narrative of how you see things. One theme that came out on the meeting on Monday that was echoing a little bit what you're saying is the sense that people individually, when they are confronted with this, even people who buy the basic narrative of the fear and the threat, will say, but the exception is Jose, my gardener, or the exception are the people that I know. And so you have this discrepancy between people's individual openness and caring,
Yeah.
and their response to this broader narrative that they're hearing.
And if I
how
could
do we
just interject there, I do think that's where also digital technology has failed us. Because the encounter, there is way too, it's, even as our technology gets more sophisticated, it is still very easy to hate and write people off in digital spaces. And so there's nothing like a person-to-person encounter to change a heart. And that's where I will lean into the hope and the prayers of Pope Francis and others who really believe in this. But I do think what you're saying is only reinforced by the way people are consuming news right now, and are getting stories that again and again about they're invading, they're attacking, and that's about people trying to have a better life for themselves and their kids, but they're invading, attacking. And so it feels different when it's someone who you love. But anyway.
Thank you. So over to you, Ruth. How
right.
do you,
I think a
where we
lot of
are
it,
and where we're going?
I feel like a lot of it has been said, and I thank I thank you, Catherine, for continuing to set the stage and reference the discussions on Monday, but I want to thank Jocelyn for giving us the international perspective. And just as she said, sometimes numbers matter. And the fact that 85% of Gazans are displaced is a number that will now sit heavily on my head for the rest of the day. Not that I didn't know the dimensions of the problem, but I didn't have a number, and it's an overwhelming number. But I think that Jocelyn and Paul have each said it. And the issue for us in this panel, in this series of panels, is basically, are faith-based organizations, and I'm going to say very loudly, faith leaders, going to be on the good side or the bad side? I mean, it seems to me that we're at a pretty dramatic moment for all of us. You know, I just met, where I am is on another panel, and a colleague of mine who's been fighting forever and spent a month in Michigan doing election work, and she just said, like, maybe this is she said, maybe this is the end for me, meaning she cannot do any more organizing. That's how she was feeling. And I'm saying, you can't feel that way. Despair is not a strategy. And the immigrant situation that we talked about, Catherine, and that the panel participants did not only on Monday, but we did an earlier panel, was in a world that we might not have loved, but it made some sense to us. And there was still a huge need to figure out, how do we deal with the fact of immigration internationally? And I just want to mention, although it's Jocelyn's universe here, and I just want to mention that another crisis of the new administration is the fact that they're going to take us backwards on climate change. And climate itself is now a cause of a tremendous number of refugees and immigrants. UN estimates that 60 million people are climate refugees. I know I'm supposed to talk about the States, but I wanted to thank Jocelyn for giving us the international perspective. But back to the States, I mean, you did an eloquent job, both of you, and Paul especially, of saying, yes, there are religious leaders who were saying, like, it's us and not them, who are playing to tribal instincts, who are talking replacement theory, all of those things. But just as there are great examples of people loving their gardener, that was a good point, but also people stepping forward. In New York City, I just want to say that the response, which is not covered in the media, of individual community organizations, not all of them, but many of them faith-based, in reaching out to New Yorkers has been extraordinary. And there's no coverage of it. So if you are a human being, you hear the people who say they're going to replace us. They are threatening the budget of New York City, whatever. You don't hear the people saying, like, we recognize that we are all immigrants and we want to fight for immigrant rights. And so for me, a lot of this is going to come down to leaders. And given, frankly, where I am, and Paul, I'm sort of the same place you are, what we got ourselves for is a leader who's going to take us back on every single one of these issues, a political leader. We need faith-based communities and we need faith-based leaders. I think for me, the challenge right now is Paul saw great examples and bad examples. And the question is, in every faith, we know that there is a commitment to taking care of the other, to meeting the needs of people in trouble. The Pope, eloquent on this issue. Where are the fill in the blank priests, imams, rabbis, ministers, pastors who are going to step up to the plate with moral courage and say what needs to be said, which is, we are all one. These are people who coming into this country as people came into this country before. And the one thing that's not on this panel, Catherine, which I realized while we were talking, is immigrants are part of, not only part of the story of America or the story of New York, they are essential to our economy. And many of the people who are speaking out in the tribal ways that Paul referenced, like, you know, get them out of here or whatever, those people are going to find out, frankly, what happens when they lose workers, right? You know, you talked about, I like Jose, my gardener. There are going to be no gardeners. There are going to be no people to do the lowest level work in food service. I don't know if you remember, about 5 years ago, maybe more, maybe it was the Trump Muslim ban. I forget when it was, but something happened in Washington. And what I adored was there was one day in which restaurants all over the country said, we're closing for a day. Because you need to know what's going to happen if all these people are sent home or not allowed to come. And it didn't get the publicity they got, but I do know some people who actually went out to dinner that night and their restaurant was closed. And they were like, what is this? And that was something that helped them catch on. So like, what I'm interested in is like, how does Georgetown, concerned with this, how do we strengthen the leadership that exists and give voice to it? And Paul, you know, not that I don't bother you every day with something else that I think you ought to be doing, but you know, what can Interfaith America, and with, as Catherine said, with your communication skills, what can Georgetown do to tell some of the positive stories and to highlight them and to recognize the platforms on which we need to stand? And in New York City right now, I mean, I think I'm going to have to spend the next month seeing how many faith leaders are willing, I'll be quite blunt, to go to the mayor and say, we demand that you stand with us in preventing the deportation of immigrants. We have 500,000 immigrants in New York who are capable of being theoretically deported by this administration. And as you know, at a cost of billions of dollars just to move them, but nobody talks about the economic cost and disruption to the city. I'm saying nobody, but the economic cost and the disruption to the city. And I'd love to say that I need good, strong political leaders, and I hope to find some, but I'm focused right now on literally what Interfaith America, the Interfaith Center of New York, whose board I co-chair, what are we going to do to help faith leaders move to and stay on and be loud about being on the correct side of this issue, which is to pursue the existing religious commitment to helping the new person, to helping the other, helping the stranger. It's in every faith. It's very hard for faith leaders to, to stir up their community and take what are essentially political positions. But I, my vision in New York is how many different faith leaders can I get in one stand-up visit to the mayor? And the good news is I know I have some, and the challenge is to get a lot. And for people to understand that this is inherent to every faith, is critical to our future, and we will all suffer politically and morally and economically if we don't find new leadership on this issue.
I am sorry, I'm gonna have to leave. There is a siren and we have to go to the shelter.
Sorry.
That is also the reality, but
That's the reality, and you're in our thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, and
I hope we can continue in
we'll
other.
continue the discussion, particularly we have one question only that I can see so far, but it is basically this question of what do we do and how do we change the narrative? Paul, this is your specialty in a way, and you focused on the specific quirks, shall we say, or the specific features of the contemporary social media. But if we look at it a little bit more broadly at this question of the narrative and turning more to what do we do you have any wisdom for us on that?
Well, there's things that I think each of us can do individually, which is, raise the voice to our local faith leader, to our local elected official, saying that, and often it's important, and I'll just say this, my organization is Interfaith Alliance, and it is, and we encourage people to go to their local school board, to go to their local legislatures, and make sure that they understand, and that we say, I represent, I am a Christian, I am a Jew, I am a Muslim, and I am saying this out of my faith tradition, that I want you to know that the people, that as part of your job as a representative of my, from my district, I want you to know how I stand on this issue. And I do think that there is a hesitancy sometime for people who may be a little bit more thinking in terms of, progressive thinking, or however you want to frame it, to be to worry that they're bringing their religion into politics. But it's the other side. It has no such worries, and so we have to be very clear about that. I think more broadly, we really, it's a time for change of messaging on pretty much everything, because I'm worried that what we've been relying on, we are a country, many of whom are descendants of immigrants, not all, certainly Native American and many Black Americans who were brought here. But, we've that things that for many of us are inspiring are not working. And so I actually think this is a time for those of us or those who are really interested in this issue is what will break through? What is a different kind of message for this moment? We are not there. And our messages clearly failed because this was, the message of welcome, the message of inclusion was articulated every time that the Democratic candidate spoke. And it did not resonate with enough voters. And so what is a message that will specifically reach out to those who are intransigent on this and are very fearful? What is a message that breaks through fear? Because I think that's what we're dealing with. We are dealing with a media landscape that is speaking specifically to gin up people's fear and gin up people's anger. And so what is a message that can break through that? And this is there are many people who are brilliant about that. We need new messages, but we also need new messengers, and we need sustained efforts. And I will say in my area, in interfaith policy work, those of us who are have been trying to do more progressive work have been outspent something like 20-1 in how we show up.
So we need money.
Well, that's one of the things. We need money. I mean, we need investment. We need to, one, recognize that religion is a major operator still. Has been an increased feeling, not overwhelming, but among democracy advocates, I would include refugee and immigrant in a broader democracy framework, who rarely have religious leadership within the democracy organizing. Now they are beginning to, because they recognize how religion is operating in ginning up fear and animosity. So we need money, but we also need really, really great messengers. And so I have done a lot in journalism. Storytelling is super important. Like, for instance, I'll tell a story that, in my child's public school, we had an influx of Venezuelan children. In my experience of my child's classrooms, that was positive. They were learning to speak Spanish. They were hearing stories of they were encountering. There are other people at the same school who said, this is the reason our classrooms were already, the class size was too large. And now this is happening. And so you have different stories that can reflect on the same incident in different ways that lead to different results. So how are we going to fight a communications battle? And this is a battle. It's not going to happen because religious folks should be nice. And I think that's the major difference. If you're a religious leader, religious organization, religious denomination, recognize the fight you're in and not the fight that you'd like to have.
Well, and to be strategic, to think of it, I want to note one comment in the question section that focuses on Ruth's arguments about the economic impact, and a Nick Kristof column that focuses on precisely this issue of both the actual benefits and the dangers. I was in a meeting yesterday that was focusing on the issues of immigration and demography, that referred to immigration as basically the secret sauce of America's success.
Mhm.
So
I
that's
love that.
a piece of the story that needs to be understood and communicated. Ruth, you're ready to jump in.
Well, I'm just going to say, yes, there are endless examples of that. We've managed in New York City under the headlines, because I can't even get the city that worked with us on this to want to publicize it, but to move some immigrants, right now small numbers, into an organization that's existed for 20 years that trains immigrants to work in food service. And they're now reaching out to all of the shelters and hotels and looking for new candidates. Well, why isn't that an organized effort in the city? And now here's the issue that I'm currently pursuing, just because it dramatizes this. There is, in the state of New York, and this, I know we're talking nationally, I promise you this is an issue in every state, I just don't have the numbers. In the state of New York, there will be the Department of Labor, straight statistical analysis, estimates that there will be a need for, I can't remember the number right now, 30,000, something along those lines. I think it's 35,000 certified nurse assistants over the next decade. So I want to be really blunt here. These are the people who will clean your bed when you can't clean it yourself. These are the people who right now are taking care of those of us who still have parents who are alive. These are essential tasks in a population that's growing older. And in New York right now, there is a program ready to go that would train individuals in this profession and get them guaranteed union jobs. And they are ready to start work with an immigrant population. And right now we have no funding to do it. And from my point of view, I'm going to go to every faith community in the city, excuse my language, that has money, which some of them do, and say, you know, put up the money. Let's demonstrate to the city and the state that we need these people. They need this training, and they will then become players in the economy and pay my Social Security.
So
Anyone who wants to invest should just get in touch with me. I'm literally putting together $5 million for the pilot program.
I think another just real, reality, is I really appreciated Jocelyn having statistics and facts, but we are in a moment where there, alternative facts has become a reality, and almost truth doesn't matter. It's just a question of how, people are putting together facts that are just completely wrong, but putting them out there on social media, which, can reach 1 million people before you can, turn your head. And so what is, I'm in Louisville at the Brandeis School of Law, and I am about to speak about Brandeis's life, and his whole understanding of the law was based on what are the facts that surround the case. And people have those facts, academics have those facts. Georgetown, academics can argue over facts, but largely they get, and then they die because the public doesn't learn the facts. And so what is the, that's another part of communications. What's the reality?
I agree, and Paul, I just want to, I'm going to say it again. It's facts, but it's also celebrating what works.
Well,
And
that's
again, I don't know if it's Georgetown, I don't know if
it's.
it's the Interfaith Alliance, I don't know, but we're talking about social media, but if we had, I don't know who does this. I mean, I don't know who we can get to do this, but if we had someone skilled in social media who knew what X was, I promise you I'm not that person, that was regularly putting out stories of here's what is happening at the Little Shop of Kindness in New York. Here's what you and the bus saw in Dubuque, Iowa, I'm making this up. With a great faith leader who was making a difference. Here are the kinds of things that are happening in a country where very often individuals motivated by faith, and sometimes, fortunately, faith leaders speak up and speak out with moral courage.
I think that with that, we can bring this webinar to a close, but the conversation clearly is just beginning. And I think those words of moral courage, but also your emphasis on facts and trying to build on facts through stories. This has been obviously a very sobering discussion. We focused on two aspects of the global displacement. In other words, the forced displacement that is mostly linked to conflict and to suffering that is the essence of the refugee and forced displacement. I think we need to emphasize that the two situations that have been the focus today don't reflect the full story, that there are 122.6 million people in the world who are in forced displacement situations, and many more who are at risk or who are facing challenges in parts of the world that we hear even less about. But I think these two examples, which come first because the United States is so close to an earthquake, a seismic set of events that change the politics and that force us, as both all of us have recognized, into a rethinking of what the situation, but also I think it's telling that Jocelyn Cesari, who was speaking to the extraordinary challenges of the Middle East, had to leave the webinar to go to her air raid shelter because there were sirens because of the imminence of conflict there. So thank you very much for joining us, the people who are online, people who will listen to the recording. And I think we have to emphasize that this is very much a continuing discussion, that we are deeply convinced that the religious elements need to be an integral part of thinking about the global crisis, that we need to be looking with open eyes and humility at the positive, the wonderful work, the heroic, the moral courage, but also at the ways in which even good teachings are distorted and in which the different aspects of people's lives ward us. So with that, thank you all, and to be continued.